The sun was barely creeping over the horizon when a sharp knock echoed through the protagonist's quiet farmhouse. The kind of knock that had no place in the peaceful solitude they had spent years cultivating on their secluded land. Slowly, they pushed open the door, finding a plain envelope resting on the doorstep. The letterhead was official-looking, embossed with the Homeowners Association seal, an association the protagonist had little reason to engage with. At first, the protagonist shrugged it off. Maybe it was just routine paperwork, something about neighborhood upkeep or a reminder for dues. But the second they tore open the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper, a chill crept over them. The text, though formally written, was like a slap in the face. "Dear landowner," the letter began, "we are pleased to inform you that the HOA has scheduled a community event on your property. A group of 100 campers, eager to participate in a weekend of outdoor activities, will be arriving on specific date. Your cooperation in hosting this event is appreciated." The words blurred together for a moment. Their brain couldn't quite process what they were reading. Scheduled a community event on their land. The protagonist had never been asked, never even been notified. There had been no conversations, no permissions granted. They had lived here for years, enjoying their peace and privacy, far removed from the politics of the neighborhood. The idea that a group of strangers would descend on their property, without so much as a word of consent, was beyond infuriating. They read it again. The letter seemed almost too polite, too impersonal for something so invasive. The HOA's tone felt condescending, as though they were doing the protagonist a favor. They could almost hear Karen's voice, the HOA board member notorious for her overbearing nature, in the back of their mind. A cold shiver ran down their spine. For the community's benefit. That phrase echoed in their thoughts like a siren. The protagonist had heard rumors about Karen before, whispers of her micromanaging, of her controlling tendencies. But this was different. This was a blatant disregard for their rights. The more they read the letter, the more their disbelief turned into a seething fury. How dare she? How dare they presume this right to overstep such boundaries? A flood of questions rose. Who approved this? Why their land? What was the real motive behind this event? It all felt so wrong. The protagonist's hand clenched around the paper, crumpling it. They paced around their kitchen, trying to make sense of it. But every attempt only deepened the gnawing suspicion that something far darker was at play. Taking a deep breath, they grabbed their coat and keys. They weren't just going to wait around and let this happen. They had lived in this house, on this land, for over a decade, and they weren't about to let some HOA decree strip them of that. They headed out the door and toward the HOA office. The letter may have been polite, but they weren't in the mood for politeness anymore. As they drove through the rolling hills toward the town, a creeping sense of dread began to settle over them. Something about this didn't add up, and they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn into something far bigger than a simple camping trip. The moment the office came into view, the knot in their stomach tightened. This wasn't going to be a simple conversation, not with Karen in charge. They parked and stepped out, their boots crunching the gravel beneath them. The air was thick with anticipation. This confrontation was inevitable. And something told them, deep down, it wouldn't be as easy as just saying no. In the distance, a dark shape loomed against the sky, and the protagonist could swear they saw a shadow watching from the trees. The sharp click of the office door echoed as the protagonist stepped inside, the dim lighting and cold, sterile air a stark contrast to the warmth of their land. The receptionist looked up, blinking in surprise at the uninvited visitor. A flash of recognition flickered across her face, but before she could speak, the protagonist cut her off, walking straight past her to the back office. "Excuse me, sir," she called after them, but the protagonist was already beyond caring. This wasn't just a matter of a camping event gone wrong. This was an attack on their life, their sanctuary. And Karen, the notorious HOA board member, was the architect of it all. At the end of the hall, the door to the office was ajar, and through the crack, The protagonist could already hear the smug, self-assured voice of Karen, chattering on the phone. Her tone was bright and insufferable, as if she were the queen of everything around her. The protagonist's fists clenched involuntarily. Taking a deep breath, they pushed the door open, and the conversation cut off mid-sentence. Karen looked up from behind her desk, her icy blue eyes narrowing as she sized them up. She was exactly how they remembered. Perfectly put together, her hair in a sharp bun, wearing a crisp suit as if she were preparing to conquer the world. It wasn't the first time Karen had made them feel small, but today, something about her presence seemed more menacing, more dangerous. "Oh, it's you," Karen said, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I was wondering when you'd show up. You got my letter?" The protagonist nodded, voice tight. "Yes, I did. And I'm here to ask why you've decided to host an event on my land without my consent." Karen leaned back in her chair, feigning surprise, her fingers tapping on the desk as if she were calculating her response. "Oh, surely you must have known this was coming," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "We've been planning the community event for months, and we're doing you a favor, really. A weekend of campers, bonding with nature. It's a great opportunity for you to showcase your property and make new connections. You should be grateful." The protagonist's pulse quickened as anger bubbled to the surface. "You're invading my property, Karen. This isn't some PR stunt. I never gave permission for any of this. I don't even know half the people you're inviting. What right do you have to make decisions like this for me?" Karen's eyes flashed with annoyance, but she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "My dear, you must understand," she said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone they had heard too many times before. "The HOA has the final say on matters like this. It's for the community. Think of the exposure. You're hardly using the land for anything else, are you?" The protagonist fought the urge to lash out, to tell her that their land was theirs, not some playground for Karen's grand designs. But they held back, forcing themselves to think strategically. Something didn't feel right about Karen's assurances, the smoothness in her voice, the way she spoke as if this was all already decided. It was too rehearsed. She wasn't just here to organize a camping event. She was here to control. "And what about the campers?" The protagonist pressed, their voice steady despite the storm brewing inside them. "What if they're not welcome? What if this is a mistake?" Karen's smile faltered for just a moment, and the brief slip caught the protagonist off guard. "Oh, they're very excited. You'll be thrilled by the turnout. Don't worry, everything's been handled." She stood, moving toward the door with unnerving confidence, as though the conversation were already over. But the protagonist wasn't ready to let her walk away so easily. "Handled?" they asked, voice rising now. "What exactly is being handled, Karen? Because this feels like a takeover." Karen paused, her hand on the doorknob. For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the icy mask she always wore. "Trust me," she said, her voice low and chilling. "You don't want to make an enemy of the HOA. This isn't something you can stop." With that, she swung the door open, her final words hanging in the air like a threat. The protagonist stood rooted to the spot, feeling the weight of her words settle in. Was this really just about a camping trip, or had they stumbled into something far more sinister? Something told them that the moment Karen had stepped into their life, the game had changed forever. The protagonist paced around their home, the silence pressing in like a suffocating weight. The walls seemed to close in with each step. Outside, the sun was sinking low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the property, making the peaceful surroundings feel more ominous. This land, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap, and Karen's smug words echoed in their mind like a sinister chant. "You don't want to make an enemy of the HOA." The protagonist's fingers tightened around the letter, crumpling it into a ball before tossing it aside. They had to think, and they had to think fast. Karen wasn't bluffing. The tone in her voice, the subtle threat, the confidence in her dismissal. told them she had all the power. But the protagonist wasn't about to let her bulldoze over them. No, this was their land, their life, and they would fight for it. They stepped into the mudroom, where the faint smell of leather and wet earth filled the air. Their pack of guard dogs lay in their kennels, eyes glowing in the low light. The dogs, an imposing blend of Dobermans, Belgian Malinois, and German Shepherds, had been trained to defend, to protect, and to obey without hesitation. Their muscles rippled under their sleek fur, eyes sharp, alert. They could sense the change in the atmosphere, just as the protagonist could. Something was about to happen, and the dogs knew it. The protagonist moved towards the kennel, speaking softly, reassuringly, but with a sense of purpose. The dogs' ears perked up as they heard their names, their tails wagging in response. These animals weren't just pets. They were protectors, fierce and loyal, ready to defend their owner with their lives. They were about to face something they had never encountered before, and the protagonist needed them to be ready. They unlocked the gate and stepped inside the large, spacious area where the dogs spent most of their time. The protagonist crouched low, looking each dog in the eyes. "You know what to do," they murmured. The dogs responded with a low growl of understanding, the hair on their necks bristling in unison. The air seemed to vibrate with energy as the protagonist gave the signal, and the dogs began to move around them, circling, stretching their limbs, their bodies rippling with quiet anticipation. The protagonist's mind raced. Karen had orchestrated this whole event. But why? Why choose their land? What was her real agenda? This wasn't about a camping trip. That much was clear. There was something more insidious at play, something hidden beneath the surface. What was she really after? The protagonist glanced out the window, their gaze sharpening as they saw the first few cars approach in the distance. The campers, or rather, the intruders, were starting to arrive. They were early. The HOA had clearly planned this with military precision. A group of families, young couples and children poured out of their cars, some laughing, some chatting, all oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. But the protagonist wasn't about to let them simply walk onto their land. They grabbed the walkie-talkie from the table and spoke in a low, steady voice. "Get ready. This is happening. Keep them back, no matter what." As the sun dipped further below the horizon, casting the land in shadows, the protagonist felt the weight of the moment settle over them. They had one chance to make sure this didn't go further, one chance to take control of a situation that was quickly spiraling out of their hands. The dogs, standing alert by the door, were ready, their hackles raised, their eyes focused on the approaching intruders. The protagonist's heart beat louder, faster, but their resolve hardened. Karen had underestimated them. She thought she could waltz onto their land, use it for her plans, and simply walk away without consequence. But the protagonist wasn't about to let that happen. The distant sound of voices grew louder, the campers moving closer, setting up tents, laying down gear, oblivious to the growing tension that loomed in the air like a thunderstorm. This wasn't just a camping trip, it was a battle, and it was about to begin. The protagonist stepped outside, locking eyes with the lead camper, a young man who waved enthusiastically, unaware of the storm that was brewing in the shadows. But behind that friendly smile, the protagonist's mind was already calculating their next move. They had to act fast. The dogs stood poised at their side, eyes glowing in the dim light, ready to do what they were trained for. "Move forward," the protagonist whispered. And with that, the storm was unleashed. The air felt thicker now, suffused with a tension that could be cut with a knife. As the first of the campers began to step onto the land, the protagonist stood at the edge of their porch, watching from the shadows. The last rays of daylight flickered behind the trees, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The distant sounds of voices, the rustling of tents being erected, the laughter of children, it all blended together in a strange symphony of intrusion. But for the protagonist, every sound was a warning, every movement an alarm bell. This wasn't right. The campers seemed innocent enough at first, laughing as they unloaded coolers and sleeping bags, their faces wide with excitement. They were just following orders, perhaps unaware of the true intentions behind the event. But the protagonist's instincts screamed that something was off. Why had Karen chosen this moment, this place, to bring them here? There had to be more to this than just a community building event. The protagonist's gaze drifted over the group, scanning the unfamiliar faces, and then their eyes locked on one man. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a faded baseball cap, he stood by the back of the group, watching the land with an intensity that sent a shiver down the protagonist's spine. He wasn't just a camper. There was something calculating in his stance, a predatory alertness that didn't belong in a camp setting. He was too observant, and his eyes, they weren't filled with excitement or the typical joy of a weekend getaway. No, his eyes were sharp, cold, like a predator stalking its prey. The protagonist's pulse quickened. What was his role? And why hadn't the others noticed him? As if reading their thoughts, the dogs at their side shifted restlessly, their eyes locked on the man as well. The protagonist took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising panic in their chest. They couldn't let their guard down. Not now. Not with the feeling of impending danger growing stronger. As the first few tents went up, the protagonist slipped into the shadows, moving swiftly and silently across the property, away from the camp. They knew they needed to see more, to understand what was really happening. The closer they got to the camp, the more the tension thickened. The campers were too focused on setting up to notice the protagonist moving through the trees. But then, just as they rounded a bend in the trail, they froze. There in the clearing just beyond the camp stood Karen. She was talking to a man in a dark suit, one of the developers. The suit was impeccable, and his expression was hard, cold. The way he stood, arms crossed, his eyes scanning the area as if assessing it for something more valuable than just a place to pitch a tent. It was clear to the protagonist that Karen wasn't here for a harmless weekend camping trip. She was working with someone. And the event wasn't about community bonding. It was about something darker, something more dangerous. The protagonist's heart skipped a beat as Karen's voice rang out across the clearing, her tone low and clipped. "The land is perfect. We'll have no problem clearing it out once we've secured everything." The developer nodded, glancing around as if imagining the land transformed into something else, something they could profit from. The protagonist's stomach churned. Secured everything. The words felt like an explosion, the realization slamming into them like a freight train. This wasn't a camping trip. This was a full-scale takeover. The developer was here to scout the land, to plan for its destruction. And Karen was in on it, playing the lead role in a much bigger scheme than they had ever anticipated. They stumbled backward, just enough to get out of sight, their heart pounding in their chest. It was worse than they thought. As the realization sank in, they felt the weight of the situation settle over them like a storm cloud. The dogs, still by their side, seemed to sense the shift in the air, their muscles tensing, the hairs on their backs rising. They were ready for whatever came next. The protagonist took a deep breath. This wasn't just about stopping a camping trip anymore. It was about protecting everything they had. Their land, their home, their future. And Karen had just made a very dangerous mistake. With a cold, steady resolve, the protagonist turned back toward the house. It was time to make their move. But the question loomed large in their mind. How far was Karen willing to go to get what she wanted? And more importantly, how far would they go to stop her? The night was rapidly falling, and with it, the sense of dread grew heavier. The moon hung like a sliver of silver in the sky, casting faint light across the sprawling land. But it felt as though darkness was creeping in from every corner. The protagonist stood on the edge of the forest, hidden in the shadows, their breath shallow, their heart thumping loudly in their chest. They couldn't just wait anymore. The realization hit them like a tidal wave. The land wasn't just being invaded, it was being prepared for something far more sinister than a few tents and campfires. Karen and the developer were scheming, and it was becoming clear that the camping trip was only the beginning. They were planning something bigger, something permanent. What did they want? Why this land? The questions gnawed at them as they stood, watching the camp from the trees. The campers were still setting up, none the wiser to the dangers lurking just beyond the property line. But in the back of the protagonist's mind, the connection between Karen's words, the developer's cold demeanor, and the strange man in the baseball cap began to form a chilling picture. This was no ordinary camping trip. This was an operation, a way to take control of the land piece by piece. The protagonist's instincts flared. They needed to act, and they needed to act now before things spiraled even further out of control. The dogs, still close by, were bristling with energy, sensing the protagonist's rising tension. The time had come to confront the invaders head-on, to show them that this land was not for the taking. The protagonist moved swiftly, slipping through the underbrush, keeping low, their eyes locked on the group of campers still too busy to notice the shift in the air. They reached their cabin and grabbed the walkie-talkie, their hands trembling slightly as they spoke into it, their voice cold and firm. "Get ready. We're about to make our move. No one sets foot past the boundary line." As the last words left their mouth, the dogs stood, alert, their eyes glowing in the darkness. The protagonist felt a surge of adrenaline. They were going to make it clear that this land wasn't for sale, wasn't for camping, and definitely wasn't up for grabs by anyone, especially not Karen. Just then, a distant shout broke the night's silence. One of the campers had noticed something amiss. He was pointing toward the trees, his voice calling out, "Hey, who's there? Is someone watching us?" The protagonist's blood ran cold. It was happening. They couldn't let the campers get any closer. The last thing they wanted was a confrontation, but this was no longer about the campers. It was about sending a message to Karen, to the developer, to everyone. This was their land, their home. With a snap of their fingers, the protagonist sent the signal. The dogs moved like shadows, swift and silent, cutting through the darkness with an eerie precision. The campers, still unaware of what was truly unfolding, were suddenly met with the low growl of the first dog. It echoed from the trees, a chilling warning that froze the air. Back away from the line, the protagonist's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, emerging from the shadows like a force of nature. "This land isn't yours to take." The campers froze in place, eyes wide, unsure of how to react. The dogs, circling, moved with a predatory grace, their eyes gleaming under the moonlight, their bodies coiled and ready for whatever came next. The air seemed to thicken with tension. And then, the baseball cap-wearing man appeared. His presence suddenly felt like a looming storm. He stepped forward, calm, but with a look in his eyes that was colder than the night itself. The protagonist could feel the energy shift as he locked eyes with them. He knew. He wasn't just a camper. He was a part of Karen's plan. "I think it's time you and I have a little talk," the man said, his voice low and dangerous, like the calm before a storm. There was no fear in his voice, only the certainty of someone who believed they were in control. The protagonist stood their ground. They were ready. But the question was clear now. Was this just a camping trip? Or was it the first move in a much larger game that Karen had already set in motion? The dogs growled, the air thick with unspoken tension. The protagonist didn't flinch. This wasn't just about stopping an invasion anymore. This was war, and they were ready to fight for everything they had. The moon cast long, eerie shadows across the land as the confrontation unfolded before the protagonist's eyes. Every nerve was on high alert, the hairs on the back of their necks standing up, the smell of the earth and trees heavy in the air. The campers, still wide-eyed and uncertain, slowly backed away, but the man in the baseball cap didn't flinch. His cold eyes locked onto the protagonist, like a predator sizing up its prey. The protagonist's heart raced as they felt the pressure building. This was no longer just a misunderstanding. It was a direct challenge. This man wasn't just here to camp. He had a purpose, and Karen's cold, calculating demeanor suddenly made a lot more sense. The dogs stayed perfectly still, their eyes unwavering, the growls low and steady, but there was no doubt they would spring into action at the slightest command. The protagonist's fingers tightened around the walkie-talkie, their mind working a mile a minute. Every second felt like an eternity. Was this what Karen had been planning all along? Was this man her enforcer, her muscle? The man took a slow step forward, his boots crunching on the ground in the stillness of the night. He didn't look at the protagonist as a landowner. He looked at them as an obstacle. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice smooth, but laced with a barely contained menace. "This land is already spoken for. You should have just let things play out." The protagonist's blood boiled. They had no intention of letting this man, or Karen, take what was rightfully theirs. The thought of the land being torn apart for development, of their life's work crumbling under the weight of corporate greed, sent a sharp sting through them. They had to stop this. Now. "Why are you really here?" the protagonist demanded, their voice steady despite the storm swirling inside them. "This isn't about a camping trip, is it? Karen isn't just trying to build community. She's setting the stage for something much darker, isn't she?" The man smiled, but it wasn't a smile of reassurance. It was the grin of someone who already knew how this game would end. "You've been paying attention," he said, his voice low and almost approving. "You're right, it's not about a camping trip. It's about moving forward with plans that have been in the works for months." His eyes flickered to Karen, still standing in the distance, watching from the shadows. "You've become a problem, and problems get eliminated." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The protagonist's mind raced. Eliminated. What did that even mean? And why was Karen so determined to bulldoze their life for the sake of development? Before they could respond, the dogs began to shift, their bodies tensing as the man moved again, this time with a swift, deliberate motion. He was reaching for something, a radio, perhaps, or another device. But the protagonist was quicker. With a sharp whistle, they signaled to the dogs. In an instant, the pack lunged forward, their bodies blurring in the moonlight as they closed the distance between themselves and the man. He staggered back, clearly unprepared for the ferocity of the attack. The dogs circled him, their teeth bared, but they held their ground, the air crackling with tension. The protagonist stepped forward, keeping their distance, but their eyes locked onto the man's. There was no fear in their gaze, only the cold fire of someone who had everything to lose. "I'll give you one last chance," the protagonist said, their voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Leave. Now. And take your plans with you. If not, you'll answer to me and my dogs. And you won't like the answer." The man's lips twitched, a dark smile forming as he straightened up, brushing dirt from his jacket. "You really think this is over? You think you're in control here?" His voice was mocking now, almost a growl. "You've already lost. The developer's got his sights set on this land, and Karen's already signed the papers. You're just delaying the inevitable." The words hung in the air like poison. The protagonist's stomach churned as the full weight of the situation settled in. Karen had already secured the deal. This was no longer just about a camping trip. It was about an entire plot of land being snatched out from under them, with corporate interests calling the shots. And worse, it seemed they had no idea just how far Karen and the developer were willing to go to get what they wanted. But one thing was certain. The protagonist wasn't going down without a fight. As the man stepped back, signaling to the campers who had begun to regroup, the protagonist's mind shifted into overdrive. They needed a plan. If Karen thought she could just steamroll their life with a few legal papers and a developer's backing, she was gravely mistaken. The game was only just beginning. And it was going to get much, much darker. The night was still, too still. The campfire crackled in the distance, casting fleeting shadows on the land, but the silence between the protagonist and the man in the baseball cap felt as heavy as stone. The dogs remained in position, their teeth gleaming in the low moonlight, but they weren't just standing guard. They were waiting for a comment, and so was the protagonist. The words the man had spoken rang in their ears. The developers got his sights set on this land. It was a cold blow to their resolve. It was no longer just about protecting their home. It was about reclaiming their future. Karen wasn't just an adversary. She was a puppet master, and the man in front of them was her tool. But now the protagonist knew something Karen didn't. They weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting for victory. The protagonist's eyes never left the man. With every moment that passed, the tension coiled tighter, each beat of their heart echoing like a drum in the quiet night. Every inch of the forest seemed to be holding its breath. The dogs were still, deadly still, but there was something unsettling about the calm. The protagonist's instincts screamed that the danger wasn't over. This wasn't just an attack. It was a game. Suddenly, the man broke the silence, his voice dripping with smug confidence. "You don't get it, do you? You're outnumbered here. You can't fight this. You can't fight Karen. The papers are signed. This land isn't yours anymore." The words stung, but they also sparked something deep inside the protagonist. Karen thought it was done. She thought she had control. But they weren't going down that easily. The protagonist exhaled slowly, a plan forming in their mind. "You don't understand," they said, their voice low and controlled. "This land is mine, and you haven't seen what I'm capable of." Their eyes flicked to the man's hands, watching for any sign of a move, but the man only laughed, as if amused by their defiance. "You think your dogs can stop me?" He gestured vaguely toward the pack, which was still poised and waiting. "You're in over your head." A flash of rage flickered in the protagonist's chest, but they kept it contained. This man wasn't the real threat. He was the distraction. With a sudden, sharp motion, the protagonist turned and gestured toward the trees. At once, two of their most loyal dogs, Titan and Luna, broke from their positions, disappearing into the dark woods with stealthy grace. The man's smug smile faltered, confusion flickering across his face. They had a plan. Before he could react, the protagonist raised a hand. "Don't move." The command was simple, but it rang with an authority that immediately halted the man's forward motion. The man stared at them, disbelief washing over his face. "What are you doing?" "Setting the trap," the protagonist said with a calmness that sent a chill down the man's spine. Their eyes never left the man as they spoke, their mind already calculating the next moves. The tension in the air thickened. The dogs, sensing the moment, moved into position. Titan and Luna had already begun their task, and the protagonist knew they had to act fast. Their strategy was simple but deadly. They weren't just going to scare the invaders off. They were going to trap them, to take back control of their land by showing just how far they were willing to go to defend it. A sudden rustling noise broke the stillness, and the protagonist's head snapped to the side. The backup had arrived. Out of the trees emerged two figures, dressed in black tactical gear. They moved silently, purposefully, and in perfect unison. The protagonist's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. The man in the baseball cap turned, his face paling at the sight of the figures. "What the hell is this?" "Insurance," the protagonist replied. "In case you and your friends didn't get the message." The men in black were silent, their eyes scanning the scene, alert and sharp. Their presence signaled a level of preparedness the protagonist had been planning for. This was their counterattack. While Karen and the developer believed they could intimidate the protagonist with their power, they had underestimated one thing. The protagonist wasn't alone. The man in the cap took a step back, his confidence faltering as the reality of the situation hit him. But it was already too late. Titan and Luna reappeared from the shadows, their eyes glowing eerily in the moonlight. The trap had been set, and it was about to snap shut. The man's eyes widened, panic creeping into his voice. "You don't want to do this. This is a mistake." But the protagonist stood their ground, unwavering. "No. You made the mistake by thinking you could take this from me. With that, they signaled to their backup. The dogs leaped forward in a synchronized blur, their speed and precision a testament to their training. The man's eyes widened in horror as the dogs closed in, and it became clear this was no longer just a fight for land. It was a battle of wills, and the protagonist was prepared to win. The moon hung heavy in the sky, its light illuminating the tense standoff like a silent witness to the clash about to unfold. The man in the baseball cap took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for his belt, but the protagonist's voice rang out before he could make a move. "Don't even think about it," they said, their tone ice-cold, their stance unwavering. The two figures in black tactical gear, now closing in, were no longer just backup. They were part of the web the protagonist had been carefully weaving over the last few days. Karen had underestimated the depths they would go to protect their land. The dogs circled the man, their eyes gleaming like twin pools of molten gold in the darkness. Titan and Luna, the most trained and lethal of the pack, moved with the precision of military units, their muscles rippling under the moonlight. They didn't make a sound. They didn't need to. The threat was clear. The man knew his options were slipping away, his escape routes shrinking with each second. "You're not getting away," the protagonist added, their voice a steel-edged whisper. "Not after what you've done. Not after everything." The man's face twisted with frustration, and for a brief moment, his eyes flickered with something more than fear. Rage. He wasn't used to being controlled, to being outmaneuvered. The realization dawned on him. He had underestimated his adversary. This wasn't just a piece of land to be taken at will. This was a battle that the protagonist wasn't going to lose. He looked over his shoulder at Karen, still standing at the edge of the camp, watching the scene unfold. But she wasn't coming to help. The protagonist could see the fleeting doubt in her eyes as she realized that the tables were turning. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a fight for survival. A flash of movement caught the protagonist's attention, and in the blink of an eye, the man lunged, trying to break through the dog's circle. But the moment he made his move, Titan and Luna sprang into action. They were faster than anyone had anticipated, their muscles coiling and releasing in perfect synchronization. The man stumbled, his hand falling just short of the knife he had tried to draw from his belt. He turned to face them, panic taking hold, but the dogs were already on him. "Stop," he shouted, his voice strained. But it was too late. The pack didn't need to be told twice. The protagonist stood still, watching with a mixture of calm and resolve as the dogs subdued the man, pinning him to the ground. The tension in the air was palpable. The night had fallen silent, save for the sound of the man's breath, shallow and quick. He was no longer a threat, just another pawn in a game that had spiraled far beyond his control. The protagonist moved forward, their eyes never leaving the man's as they crouched down to meet his gaze. "You don't get to decide what happens here," they said softly. "This land is mine. This home is mine. And you've crossed a line you won't be able to uncross." The man's mouth opened to retort, but the words died on his lips. The weight of his situation had finally settled on him. The dogs, their eyes unwavering, growled low in unison, reminding him of the cold, hard truth. He had lost. Behind them, Karen had retreated into the shadows, her figure a fading silhouette as she realized that her plan was unraveling. But the protagonist wasn't done yet. The dog's grip on the man loosened as they stepped back, waiting for the next command. This wasn't just about putting the man in his place. It was about ensuring Karen would never try this again. The protagonist turned to the two figures in black tactical gear. "It's time. Bring Karen in." The men moved swiftly, crossing the camp with military precision. They'd been watching, waiting for this exact moment, the moment when they could secure everything. Within seconds, Karen was surrounded. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable now, a far cry from the confident woman who had orchestrated everything. She knew her plan had failed. She knew the game was up. The protagonist stepped forward, their voice calm but laced with fury. "I gave you a chance, But you thought you could take everything from me without consequence. Now you'll answer for it." Karen's defiant stance crumbled under the weight of the protagonist's words. She looked at the man in the baseball cap, but it was too late. Her scheme had already collapsed. "This is just the beginning," Karen sneered, though her voice lacked conviction. "You think you've won. You're just delaying the inevitable. The developers will find another way." But the protagonist wasn't fazed. This wasn't about victory in a single moment. It was about sending a message. "No, Karen," they said, standing tall with an unyielding gaze. "This is the end of your plan, and I will make sure you never come close to this land again." As the tactical team escorted Karen away, the protagonist stood still, taking in the silence of the night. The dogs remained by their side, watchful and loyal. The land was theirs again, but the battle had changed them. They had faced the darkness and come out on the other side. They had won, and now they would make sure it stayed that way.